This is Taking Stock, and we've been let loose on Uveka and Dan's couch for the evening. They won't need it until tomorrow, so it's fine. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you with us. This evening, we're looking at the year that has been 2018, and what a tumultuous year it has been, politically, socially, and economically. So two top economists with us this evening on Taking Stock. Isaah Mhlanga, he is the executive economist at Alexander Forbes, and Gina Schoeman, who is the South Africa economist at Citibank. Now, Gina Schoeman, let's start with you, because 2018, you've been looking back at the history of 2018. You've filled a foolscap page, you turned it over, and you've probably filled another 3. It's been massively eventful.
Very much so. I mean, looking back at just how the year began in January and how we've persevered through the year, I can't remember another year as volatile in both global and local issues. I mean, if you look at monetary policy, we went from a rate cut to a rate hike. And then, of course, on fiscal policy, we went through 3 different finance ministers.
We started the year, just to remind everybody, with Malusi Gigaba. He was there. We then went briefly to Nhlangane for his 3rd term as finance minister. That was cut short on matters of disclosure around the Guptas, and we got Tito Mboweni thrown into the mix.
Yes, and I would say, you know, the first stage of that was largely expected, because once Cyril Ramaphosa had won that conference, the ANC conference at the end of 2017, I think we all had quite a good idea that we would see some kind of changes take place within the ANC that would eventually lead to a removal of Zuma, etc., etc. So I think the first changeover to Nene was somewhat expected. It was the changeover to Mboweni that was really not expected, especially at the same time that the budgets changed. So between February and October, to me, one of the most important changes we saw this year for an economist looking at fiscal policy was just how awful the South African Revenue Service actually was. And that explains the difference between those 2 budgets, why we went from an okay-ish February budget to an October budget that really wasn't great at all. And I think there is a Mboweni effect now, where people think that Tito Mboweni has quite a lot of political clout and therefore could do something towards the February budget, but hey, we've just seen Eskom's in another big mess, or reminded of their big mess, so that's how we're ending the year.
Yeah, we are. I mean, it's been massively eventful. We went from Ramaphoria in the first quarter to a Rama reality that wasn't very comfortable in the second quarter, to a Rama with a rude word in the third quarter, as it was very clear that we were in recessionary territory, and we kind of in a Rama bumble along into Christmas and the New Year. We had massive expectations, I think, politically, socially, economically, everything come January, and that reality that actually the South Africa turnaround, if allowed to happen, is going to take a long time to fix the mess that was created over a decade.
I think if you look last year, this time around, we were all looking forward to see what was the outcome of the ANC elective conference.
That's almost a year
I think
to the
for
date,
me, exactly. I think for me, that is the biggest change, or the biggest shift that happened, that underlies all the economics that you see, that underlies all the political change within the institutions, whether you look at SARS, the NPA, is that political change that took place in December last year, culminating in Cyril Ramaphosa becoming president earlier in the year, that underline much of what we see today. But I think globally, which is quite important, because we tend to look inward. South Africa is a very small open economy. What happens globally tends to overshadow what happens locally. So they move from a synchronized economic growth to the US growing alone to now potentially a synchronized slowdown as we move into next year. I think those are the biggest shifts that are likely to shape where we go into next year.
I mean, one of the luckiest moves we've had this year, I suppose, Gina, was in that first quarter. Moodys very quick out of the blocks to give us an upgrade. They took us from a negative outlook to a stable outlook. The ratings agency that hates us least is Moodys, and they are the ones that have kept us away from pure sub-investment grade rating. Can they hold off much longer, I wonder?
Well, I must admit, we didn't expect them to downgrade earlier this year, but I was surprised by the stable outlook, and that does buy South Africa some time. So very quickly, how the rules work is that once you're on a stable outlook, there's no ticking time bomb as to making a decision. If they were on a negative outlook, still there would be a ticking time bomb.
There'd be a time frame they'd have to make a call.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that would have created even more market jitters going into the rest of this year as things got worse, from the recession to Eskom to the changes in cabinet to the budget, etc. So they could justify a negative outlook right now. if they wish to. I mean, there is enough, and S&P's done it, and Fitch has done it. There's enough on the landscape. However, they've also left it so long at this point, and everyone's watching them, that their own credibility is at stake. Now, they don't have another review this year. They've gone past the one that they were supposed to do on the 12th of October. So we'll only actually know if one of two different ways. Either we wait until their first scheduled review, which is usually in April, May of 2019, and we haven't got a calendar yet. And that would take them through the budget and into that election campaign. And maybe they feel as if they'd have sufficient information at the time to either stay unstable, wait a little bit longer, or go negative. But there is another way that they could just decide, and that's if something really bad happened.
The lights went off.
Well, yes, a blackout or some kind of financial implosion at Eskom, but certainly I think the Eskom topic right now at the end of the year is still keeping everyone very nervous, because if pushed, Moodys could very easily stand up and move South Africa to a negative outlook.
And that's concerning.
I think, however, they did the right thing by changing the outlook to stable. One of the concerns they had was political risk, which with the change of president, we have seen a lot of changes within SOEs in terms of management.
Much of that risk has disappeared.
Exactly, it has disappeared. So it is with reason that they changed from negative to stable. Of course, in terms of economic growth, we were not going to turn around the economy overnight. It takes some time before you turn around an economy, and that they know. In any case, growth has been weak for a very long time. It has been declining, and they've held off because of the strength of our institution. If we didn't get the political change, we would have been downgraded because our institution would have been continued on a gradual decline. So to give South Africa some time to effect a change in institution, and therefore to actually boost economic growth, I think they did the right thing.
So there's a huge amount at stake here. I mean, for Eskom to keep the lights on, to Eskom to keep the bailiffs away from coming to remove the furniture, for Tito Mboweni to deliver a budget that is some kind of miraculous showstopper, that shows signs of spending cuts, that shows no increases in taxation, because then he will face some kind of revolt, no doubt, and some kind of mechanism to grow this economy. I mean, we've had summits, we've had meetings, we've had plans, we've had all kinds of sessions which are yet to transpire into any kind of meaningful growth.
The growth picture is a difficult one because, as Isaah stated, next year we don't have the benefit of the global economy picking up or picking up strongly at all. If anything, the risks are that this is going to potentially be even slower global growth than anticipated.
Can I be Pollyanna-ish about this, though? Can I dare to say, for the first time in a decade, we're seriously talking about growth. We're seriously talking about the fact that we need to be getting growth, and we need to be liberating business to do that growth. We need to be bringing in private enterprise in some form into electricity generation and distribution, into the likes of an SAA, to stop them being such a big drain on the fiscus. Those conversations couldn't happen this time last year. They are now happening. Not that conversations are never good enough, but boy, we're heading in the right direction.
Not doing anything was going to force us to start talking about them anyway. Yeah. So I think if you are forced by the economic situation or circumstances to make change, you undertake that change under difficult circumstances. But if you deliberately make the change before you are forced to, it means you have better control to actually effect where you want to.
How far are we away from South Africa being forced to make changes?
We are very close. We are very close to being forced because we have postponed for so long to make the necessary changes. Now we are, on the edge of being downgraded if growth doesn't pick up, but we also have issues of Eskom, but Eskom has issues of finances. We don't have the funding, and they can't access, funding through private, investors, which means we have to make a call to institute fiscal austerity on our own, or else we will be forced to run to the IMF to borrow money if we don't do it.
And that's a fine higher grade conversation. But high grade conversations don't play out well in election campaigns. They provide a stick with which your opponents can beat you. The moment that there's any suggestion of austerity, that you may be cutting back on grants, that you may not be expanding grants, that you might be harming in some way people who really need help in the South African economy simply because there isn't enough money, because you're trying to beat off the IMF with a stick. That's not a great election campaign, and we run into this unfortunate scenario where by May next year we all have to vote.
But there is I think austerity could be a very broad term, and maybe to pick up on that, Maybe not through expenditure cuts that would hurt people, maybe not through revenue initiatives that would hurt the people, but you could avoid the IMF by doing something on the debt side of South Africa. So if you had to do something that alleviates the risk on what we call contingent liabilities, which is obviously the government guarantees to all of these state-owned enterprises, even something slight, like an announcement that Eskom is going to A, shift some of its debt away, but also B, take off some of its workforce.
Isn't that, though, the same as shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic? You're taking the debt from Eskom, you're saying, well, we'll put it on government's balance sheet. Well, Eskom is government. I mean, it's technical, yet those sorts of games satisfy people.
Yeah, so they'd have to have a package. They'd have to do something in other state-owned enterprises. You know, you have to start announcing reform very quickly. I mean, there are some things you can do without affecting the social scenario in South Africa. I mean, I'm trying to just play devil's advocate with the fact that we don't expect much to happen because of the election. And certainly investors are sitting on their hands. We're in what I call a holding pattern because corporates, institutional investors are all just looking at South Africa in 2019 and saying, well, we'll decide once we know the outcome of the election. But if they are just sitting there, maybe you could do a couple of tweaks here and there in terms of some kind of reform, even if small. It still just continues to send that right signal.
Okay, it's about sending signals.
I think we have done a lot of small tweaks for a very long time, and they haven't worked. We can talk about shifting Eskom's debt, how exactly the details matter. Do we shift them to the state's balance sheet? That will result in an actual downgrade from Moodys. What Eskom requires is a partial privatization. What SAA requires is complete privatization. That will remove the massive amount of debt that is guaranteed by the state.
I've got a second-hand car outside. It's 20 years old. It needs a new cam belt, but I want 100,000 rand for it. You're going to laugh in my face. Eskom is a little bit like that. It's got a fraction of its generating capacity working. Modupi and Kusile are way over budget and over time. The liabilities there are huge. We're sitting in a situation where we're trying to sell a really scrappy, rusty second-hand car, and we're wanting top dollar for it. That's quite a big
It's very difficult, I agree, but that is the conversation that we need to be having instead of trying to shift money from, debt from Eskom to the state. That is not going to solve the problem.
It is better to take pain now if the pain later on is going to be greater. So maybe if we all accept that.
But this has been the same thing for a decade. I mean, we've never been able to take the hard decisions. What is going to be the catalyst for the hard decision? I
think if you had taken the pain of selling off parts of Eskom 5 years ago, you wouldn't have been as close to the edge as South Africa is right now. I mean, we have very little cushioning. And growth is sub 1%, probably next year too, at the rate we're going. If you look at our twin deficit situations, current account and fiscal policy, we don't have a lot of room to maneuver with. And even at the SARB, they've had to start hiking interest rates slowly because they're trying to get inflation at lower rates. But that's all the inefficiencies South Africa just keep going against them. And if anything, if inflation keeps surprising to the downside, it's because growth is so weak, not because this economy is more efficient.
I mean, we're sitting this evening with joyful and more joyful, my guests tonight. Anybody who told you that Christmas was the season to be jolly isn't watching this program. It has been a rough year for 2018, and it doesn't really set up 2019 for any great shakes. However, there are some interesting things happening in the economy. The big drop in the petrol price in December, followed by a likely drop in January, does interesting things to the inflation outlook. We can talk about whether the Reserve Bank should or should not have cut interest rates and what that means for your back pocket and what it does for confidence if and when elections happen. Eskom doesn't fall flat on its face and by some miracle we manage to pull ourselves back from the brink. Do we have the building blocks to start correcting the South African economy? More in a moment.